Well, thank you very much, Debbie, for inviting me. I look very much forward to speaking with you.
My mic's off. Okay, there's always a mic that's off. Okay, let me start over. So this is Debbie Aldrich. Welcome to the show. This is with On Freedom's Voice, and my special guest. I think you heard him. You didn't hear me, but Ali Safavi from Iran. So Ali, I just want to give you a little intro. You are on a Foreign Affairs Committee. You sit on the National Council of Resistance of Iran, and you're a writer and commentator on Iran and the Middle East. So anything else you want to tell about yourself? Give us a little, let the audience know a little bit about who you are and why I have you on today, because you are a specialist and analyst in this area.
Well, yes, indeed. Well, I came to the United States in 1971 and became active in the anti-Shah movement as a student. I studied sociology at the UCLA in California. And of course, we worked very hard with other Iranians who wanted to free Iran. And all of us, with the millions in Iran, succeeded in overthrowing the Shah's regime. Regrettably, an imposter called Khomeini took advantage of a power vacuum that existed then and stole the revolution. But we were not pacified. We were not disappointed. We continued the fight. And of course, now, as you have witnessed in the streets of Tehran over the past few weeks, it seems that a second revolution is in the making, and we're working very hard to make that happen and bring freedom to Iran and peace and stability to the region.
Absolutely. Now, before we go much further, I have a clip from when you were on Newsmax and the American Forum. It goes back to 2015. So I'm going to play that for the audience, and hopefully everyone will hear the audio on this. Let's see if this is going. I'm going to play that for the audience, and hopefully everyone will hear the audio.
Our president is sitting down and negotiating with the regime of Iran. Iran has probably been responsible for more American deaths than any singular terrorist group. It is undisputably the largest supporter of terrorism in the world.
The words of former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani as we welcome you back for the final hour of America's Forum on this Wednesday, alongside Miranda Khan, J.D. Hayworth here. And Miranda, in that speech, Rudy basically said all terror the final hour of America's Forum back on this Wednesday,
Tehran,
alongside Miranda Khan,
Iran
J.D. Hayworth here.
Several
and Miranda,
terrorists,
in that
and
speech,
the U.S. even recognizes the regime as the world's leading source of terrorism. So many are asking, why is the president that Iran has been with terrorists?
Let's go in depth on this, and we are joined by Ali Safavi, the U.S. spokesman for the National Council of Resistance of Iran. He's also the president of the Near East Policy Research Center. We are joined by us from Washington, D.C. Likewise, the U.S. spokesman for the National Council of Resistance. For the entire hour, we're pleased to welcome. He's also the president of the Near East Policy Research. We are joined. Welcome. And Ali, where has Iran been most active in supporting terror?
Well, first of all, good morning, JD, and thanks for having me. Well, the genesis to the current rise of fundamentalist Islam goes back to 1979, when the mullahs usurped the leadership of the 1979 revolution, and they made one of the pillars of the regime, their strategy, was to export of terrorism and fundamentalism beyond Iranian borders. And of course, they've been active all over the place, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen now, and of course in Afghanistan. And so clearly, I think when you talk about the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, you cannot ignore the fact that the Iranian regime has acted as the godfather, if you will, of this dangerous phenomenon that is threatening not only regional peace, but also international and global.
Okay, Ali, we just watched a clip and basically, I don't know if you were able to hear the clip at all, but maybe you remember it when you were on Newsmax.
I did. Actually, I did.
It looped a little bit because I forgot to turn our mics off. But I want you to talk a little bit about that clip because of what you were saying, as I said before I played the clip, is something you could have said today.
That's absolutely correct. And as I said then, I think events since 2015 have proved beyond the shadow of doubt that the root cause of all of the problems that we face now in the Middle East, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Bahrain, and even beyond the Middle East, now in Latin America, is the regime in Tehran, because this regime can only survive by trying to export its medievalist ideology beyond its own borders. It is in the constitution of the Iranian regime that its number one task is to export this revolution. And that's because, obviously, the mullahs are a ahistorical regime. They cannot understand or provide solutions to the problems that Iran has today, economically, socially, and politically. That is why, instead of investing the wealth of the Iranian nation on the lives of the Iranian people, especially the youth of Iran, which comprise 70% of the 80 million Iranians, they, for example, have spent about $100 billion over the past 5 years in Syria. And in fact, the military budget is something like $53 billion, whereas the amount of money they allocate to healthcare for 80 million Iranians is only 16 billion. So you can see where their priorities are. And so from my perspective, the regime in Tehran now poses the gravest threat, not only to the people of Iran, not only to the people of the Middle East, but also, I think, to the global peace and security.
So the youth today are demonstrating, and they're the children of the people who were there when the Shah was in power and experienced a level of liberty and certain amount of freedom. Although the Shah had his enemies and, you know, he was still a dictator, but for the most part, and you can explain this better, he allowed people quite a bit of freedom. It was a very westernized country, and Tehran was a thriving city. It's the Paris of the Middle East. I had many friends that lived there. So these are the products that the youth that are demonstrating today or leading the demonstrations are the products of the parents of those people who lived during that time, are they not?
Indeed, that is the case. Obviously, having lived in Iran myself when I was going to high school, naturally, as you said, to some degree, Shah at least did not intervene in the personal lives of Iranians. But beyond that, naturally, the Shah was no Democrat. And ironically, the very reason that Khomeini and the mullahs were able to usurp the leadership of a popular revolution was because the Shah had decimated the democratic liberal opposition. Many of them were executed, others languished in prisons and under torture. And that, of course, allowed Khomeini to step in and consolidate power in Iran. But as you said, now, of course, the youth of Iran have no illusions about the current regime in power, and their chance of death to the dictator and death to Khamenei and Rouhani, and also the chance of a hardliner reformer, the game is now over, clearly undercuts the narrative that the Iran apologists have been trying to feed people in Washington inside the Beltway that this regime in Iran is here to stay, and that the only way forward, the only proper policy, if you will, is to engage it as opposed to helping the Iranian people to bring freedom and democracy to their nation.
So, as I said, the youth are the product of the parents who actually experienced some of that liberty under the Shah. And yes, the Shah was no angel, but he, like you said, allowed the citizens, it didn't interfere with the average citizen in Iran, and allowed for commerce and people to enjoy kind of a Western culture almost at that time. I mean, they had fashion, they were thriving restaurants and things like that. But having said that, the chance of death to America. So I think a lot of viewers are wondering about that. We've seen over the years the chance of death to America. We do know that America propped up the Shah to some extent to keep, and you can explain this better, to keep the region stable. And so how do you see that playing out? And is that propaganda that we've heard over the years, death to America, is that a group of people that actually feel that way or buy into the propaganda? And also, a few years ago, when President Obama did his Arab Spring, the Iranian youth were begging for him to come to Iran and do the same thing that he did and failed at, frankly, in Egypt. But the Iranian youth were desperate for some help, and the people themselves desperate for some help to gain some freedom and liberty. And then the other thing, well, speak on that if you can.
Sure. I think you've raised a very, very good point. There's no question that initially, at the time of the revolution, the Iranian people were not favorably disposed toward the United States, because they felt that a few years before, in 1953, the CIA and MI6 had overthrown a popularly elected nationalist prime minister, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, who was extremely popular in Iran. And so Khomeini, actually, he was in a sense, if you will, he had dark genius, and he exploited those sentiments to his own favor. That said, I must tell you, and this is somewhat of an irony, that the people of Iran, in virtue of their history to which you referred earlier in the show, have tremendous affinity for the people of America and the United States. Some say they are the most pro-Western people in the whole of the Middle East. And so the chance that you hear during Friday prayer leaders, or you see some folks burning the US flag, these are paid agents of the clerical regime, even members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps or the notorious paramilitary Basij force. And that in no way represents the feelings and sentiments of millions of Iranians toward the United States. And unfortunately, of course, you mentioned President Obama. In 2009, the chants in the streets of Iran were, Obama, are you with us or you're with the mullahs? And unfortunately, the president chose to remain silent, and that in many respects enabled the regime to suppress the 2009 uprising. I think to his credit, President Trump has been very outspoken from day one, both regarding the nuclear deal, but also in respect of Iran's nefarious activities in the Middle East region, and also with regards to the protests that erupted in his tweets and his policy statements. I think his policy statement at the United Nations was a landmark, and it encouraged Iranians to take a more proactive, aggressive approach against the regime, because they knew that this time around they will not be alone, and at least when it comes to the United States, that they would have the political and the moral support of the US government and the American people. But of course, we feel that more needs to be done in terms of taking effective and practical measures to curtail Iranian attempts to suppress its own citizenry and provide help, especially communication to Iranian youth to communicate with each other.
So, talking about that and bring up the Iran deal, how do you view that from your perspective, the Iran deal that was done by President Obama? And, you know, and the American people were unaware until it was already in process or already took place. How do you see that playing out? What are the pros and cons of that?
Yes.
If you can expand on that.
Sure. There's no question that the Obama administration gave too many concessions to the regime in Tehran to secure that deal. As you may know, it was our movement, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, which in 2002, for the first time, revealed Iran's 2-decade-old clandestine nuclear weapons program. And in the past 20 years or so, we have made 80-some revelations about different dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. We feel that the Iranians came to negotiating table on their hands and knees because of the sanctions that Congress has adopted. The regime was, as the President Trump, I remember, said a few months ago, was on the verge of collapse. And so they came to the U.S. begging for help. And we feel that if the Obama administration had taken a tougher stance, they could have exacted much more concessions from the regime in Tehran, although nobody knows now what the mullahs are doing in hiding, because unfortunately the Iran deal offers no airtight inspection mechanism. The military sites are not open to inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. A very critical part of bomb making, which is the weaponization, has not been addressed by the IAEA. They basically pushed everything under the rug. And so who knows, maybe as we speak and as Iranians claim to be complying with the JCPOA, with the terms of the deal, that they may be someplace hidden under some mountain or some site engaged in high explosive testing and working on the weaponization to perfect making of a bomb. So the JCPOA has it left a lot to be desired. And I think the president's approach is correct in calling on Congress to eliminate the loopholes and put in mechanism, including ending the sunset clause, which would enable Iran, I guess, 5 years from now, to go home free and do whatever it can or wants regarding its nuclear program.
So talking about the nuclear program and the Iran deal, we're supposed to be able to have inspectors go in and inspect. But like you said, it could be hiding under, a mountain. I actually have a friend that's a nuclear engineer, and we were roommates in college. We debated this often about the Iran deal after, of course, it took place. She is a liberal, and her feeling was, well, at least it might help keep the Iranians from developing a nuclear bomb. Well, I laughed because I said, just like it kept Saddam Hussein for doing what he did. If you remember, this sounds so similar to me. It's like we keep doing the same thing over and over again. If you remember, under Bill Clinton, Saddam Hussein, we were, after we pushed them back out of Kuwait, we were supposed to be able to go in and have inspections to make sure there were no chemical weapons of mass destruction. Although Bill Clinton upheld those inspectors for like 10 months. And I mean, if there were weapons of mass destruction, or chemical weapons of mass destruction, in 10 months, they could be moved anywhere, perhaps Syria, wherever. I'm not saying that that's what happened, but because we haven't seen real proof of that, but it certainly is one of these policies that if you can't go in at any given notice or moment, when you put these caveats in a deal, especially when you're inspecting for weapons like nuclear weapons, chemical weapons of mass destruction, what good does it do even having them if you're going to delay it?
Absolutely. I must tell you, though, that the inspections by Anscom and Anmovik in Iraq were far more intrusive than what the IAEA is doing now in Iran. The military sites where basically all of the nuclear testing is undertaken are off limits to IAEA inspectors. They've never visited any military site, save for a short inspection a couple of years ago of one site called Parchin, but no other military site has ever been open to the IAEA. And as you said, given the nearly 3-decade history of denial and deception and duplicity by this regime, you cannot trust them. I think when President Reagan was dealing with the Soviet Union, he was saying trust and verify. I would say with regards to the regime in Tehran, don't trust and verify. And that's clearly what the attitude should be. And again, I think President Trump ought to be commended for telling Congress this is not a good deal and let's fix it. And when he says if you can't fix it, then he's not going to honor it. I think that's a correct position to take.
Absolutely. So how do you feel about the Iranians going to the EU Parliament? A couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of dissension and division about them attending that, just like there was when the president of Iran came a number of years ago to the UN here in New York City on our soil after chants of death to America. I don't understand why we allowed him on our soil, UN or no UN. And I think a lot of people in the UE felt the same way. How do you see that?
Well, I think the European Union position vis-a-vis the recent uprising in Iran is truly disgraceful. European Union champions itself as safeguarding and upholding human rights. They even have a human rights convention. But the European Union reaction to the brutal suppression of the uprising in Iran over the past few weeks, the arrest of 8,000 citizens, they themselves admitted arresting 5,000, the killing of 50 protesters, 12 of whom have died in custody.
I heard some were burned to death. That was one of the stories I heard.
And they also said some committed suicide, which was ridiculous. And the European Union has not condemned any of this. And as you said, they invite a senior Iranian official to the European Parliament, and they talked to him. And he, of course, brazenly, I saw his press conference, he brazenly said, yes, we will deal harshly with, in his words, terrorists. And of course, these were young kids running around in the streets of Iran, the impoverished in Iran, the army of the hungry, and the women who were justifiably demanding their rights, and they wanted to take their country back from the mullahs. So to be honest with you, I think Europeans have a lot to answer for when it comes to Iranian regime atrocities against its own citizens.
I would agree. It's really sad that woman, the first woman that we saw anyway, that stood up and took her hijab off, wrapped it around, or started waving it for liberty. And I think I was talking to you earlier about an 80-year-old woman. I think you saw the clip as well. Just the other day, I believe it's recent, climbed up. Here it's snowy and icy in Tehran. And with her cane, she climbed up, an 80-year-old woman, onto a fountain pedestal and took her headscarf, her hijab off, wrapped it around her cane, and waved it in protest for wanting liberty back in their country. If that picture, as I told you earlier today, no words need to be said. When you see a woman that can barely walk with a cane get up and fight for freedom, this woman at one time in her life experienced a fair amount of liberty and freedom, and now it's oppressed. And the Iran deal did not buy the Iranian people with all the money that was shipped in the cloak of night on an unmarked plane by the last administration, did not buy food or provide jobs or, things that the Iranian people are protesting about. That's one of their big issues, because they're hungry. They don't have jobs. I mean, it didn't help them one bit, because what are the Iranians doing with those billions of dollars that Obama sent them?
Exactly. I think I could not have said it any better. Unfortunately, the billions and billions of dollars that Iran makes off of its oil revenues, doing business with Europe, all of that is spent on either fomenting chaos, war, bloodshed in neighboring countries, or fills the coffers of the mullahs. You know that the Supreme Leader Khamenei, just a footnote, when Khomeini came to Iran, he said, we will be the government of the oppressed and the government of the abased. Yet Khamenei now is the richest man in the world, even richer than Jeff Bezos, the head of the Amazon. His wealth runs in, according to an investigative report by Reuters news agency, to the something close to $95 billion. And Iranian officials and their children, there's a Instagram account in Tehran now called the Rich Kids of Tehran. And these are the children of the Iranian regime's officials, driving Lamborghinis and Ferraris and Mercedes-Benz, living this lavish lifestyle, when millions of Iranians cannot make ends meet. Now selling kidneys and even corneas have become commonplace in Iran for poor people. Some families, this may be shocking to your viewers, some families are forced to sell their unborn children to make ends meet. And there were reports that some families sold their young daughters to these rich old men for $400. So that's extremely tragic and inhumane. And yet the Obama administration and the Europeans decided to give billions and billions of dollars to the regime in Tehran, which, as you said, has been spent in the tragedy that we have witnessed for the past 6 years in Syria, with 500,000 people killed, 4 to 5 million refugees in Europe. You see the situation in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, all over the place. And in many respects, that money acted as an enabler for the regime to pursue its sinister, nefarious objectives in the rest of the world.
So that money that was sent right during Obama's last year, in his last term, shipped that money out, because, if he had done it earlier in his administration, in his term in Washington, probably could have looked at some impeachment or some other kind of, situation. I think people would have been protesting in the streets, because now we know for sure that the Iranians have used a lot of that money, maybe most of it, to prop up, like you said, nefarious terrorist groups throughout the world, especially in the Middle East. Now we see ISIS moving into like Indonesia and the Philippines, in other areas. It's like, I wrote this the other day, it's like ISIS and these terrorists are taking their caliphate on the road, and they're adapting, evolving, morphing into other ways to push their caliphate and their propaganda, mostly propped up by, because how else are they going to get the money? But mostly propped up by Iran. Because I don't, at one time when they went into Syria and Iraq, they definitely, robbed many banks and took a lot of money that way. But eventually it ran out because they were having to buy weapons. And where are they getting these weapons from? And they were, paying all these people that were coming in, a lot of them from Europe and quite a few from the U.S. to come and fight with the jihadis. And so it was really propped up by Iran. So have you seen that too, where, am I correct in saying, so ISIS is kind of taking their caliphate on the road, and they're evolving and morphing and figuring out other ways to spread their their caliphate and their terror since Trump came into office and has pretty much rid them from Iraq.
Well, I think that when it comes to ISIS, and for that matter, the Al-Qaeda, obviously, they have a very brutal mentality and ideology and very brutal practices. But keep in mind that all of the atrocities that ISIS and the Al-Qaeda and Taliban have committed, and we have come to witness them, a lot of those are going on in Iran as we speak today. In fact, many of those inhumane punishments, like beheadings and stoning people to death, gouging out eyes, and things of that nature, are written into the Iranian constitution. So in many respects, I would argue that the ideology that the Iranian regime promotes, advocates, and exports is far more dangerous than what ISIS and Al-Qaeda are doing, because you have a nation state behind it. The resources of a country of 80 million people, a country that I think has the second largest gas reserves, is the fourth largest exporter of oil. Iran is a very rich country, and you see all of those resources at the service of exporting this backward ideology, not to mention that the recent released documents by the CIA that were captured when Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan demonstrate a clear linkage and cooperation between the regime in Tehran and Osama bin Laden. And if you remember, a lot of people were arguing that, well, Iranians are Shia and Al-Qaeda are Sunni, and so they don't work together. That's absolutely not the case. In fact, the Iranian regime, for them, political expediency governs everything. It doesn't matter whether you're Sunni, Shiite, or even communist. Recall that the Iranian regime had the best relations with the Soviet Union before the fall of the Soviet Empire. And so in this sense, you're absolutely correct that the mere presence of a nation state that promotes such extremism provides ideological fodder to extremist and terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And from our perspective, our movement, in fact, our president-elect, Mrs. Rajavi, who, by the way, is a woman, has said that so long as the regime in Tehran stays in power, you cannot drain the swamp of extremism and fundamentalism in the world. Because this antidote, if you will, to the extremist Islam that we see propagated by Iranian regime, by ISIS, by Al-Qaeda and others, is a democratic, tolerant Islam that believes in gender equality, that believes in universal suffrage, that believes in equality of all religions before the law. And in that sense, that's what our movement is advocating, and that's what we've been fighting for over the past 52 years. And of course, 39 years of that has been against the regime in Tehran now. And I must also say, for your viewers, that 120,000 of our movement's members and sympathizers, including my own brother, have been executed by the regime in Tehran today. So we've paid a tremendously high price to bring freedom to Iran and, by extension, peace and stability to the region. I'm sure that we will succeed, given the audacity and the courage of these young Iranians who all of us saw in the streets of Iran over the past few weeks.
Yes, I think this is a good time to play another clip that just took place a few days ago, and it's Newt Gingrich speaking on Fox News, and it shows clips of some of the protests so the audience can see a little bit about what we're talking about, and then we'll talk about those clips in just a second. So once again, I'm going to turn our mic.
Word out about Iranian population and the mood. We know they're young, we know they're highly educated, but man, we are seeing their frustration bubble over, aren't we?
We are, and I think President Trump is exactly right to be pushing hard to be publicly condemning the dictatorship. I think you're seeing the dictatorship once again, this will be the fourth time now, being delegitimized. At one point in the late 1980s, they actually killed 30,000 people to try to establish their control of the country. And I think once again, you're seeing people in Iran say, look, this is not a good deal. It's not a good standard of living. You're taking all this money Obama gave you and you're spending it on Hezbollah and on Hamas and on making trouble around the region. We want you to spend it here at home. And this is a very, I think, very important moment to really push the dictatorship and decide publicly with the Iranian people.
Well, our president is now saying this morning, sanctions if you don't allow them to continue to protest. What happens next? What will they take down this dictatorship? What do you foresee in to protest? What happens next? What will...
Okay, so we heard Newt Gingrich pretty much say the very same thing that you were saying. But what I wanted the audience to really see was the footage of the violence that is taking place there. And that was just a few days ago. So speaking on that, where do you see the future? How do you see this what do you see our president being very pivotal in this? And also, what countries are buying Iran's oil and propping them up at this point?
Yes. Well, I think as regards to the first part of your question,
sorry, it's too many things in there, I guess.
But, yes. In terms of what the future holds, I think that December 27th, when the first protest broke out in the eastern city of Mashhad, and then quickly spread to 142 cities, I think marks a watershed when it comes to the Iranian people's struggles for freedom. If you recall, in 2009, when the protest began over a stolen election, it took about 6 months for the chance of the people in the streets to go from where is my vote to down with the dictator. This time, it took only 2 hours. And you can see that the bulk of the people who were involved in the uprising this time around in 2018 are the impoverished people of Iran, the young people, women, the lower middle class, not the rich kids of Tehran, not the upper middle class of Iran who live in northern Tehran. They have a very comfortable life. And so the very people that many analysts, obviously apologists of the Iranian regime, led us to believe are the backbone of this regime, the source of its power, they are the ones who revolted. And I do not believe that you can turn the tide of history. I think something has started. It will have its ebbs and flows. But I think ultimately we are closer than ever to the overthrow of the mullah's regime, first and foremost because the underlying causes of the uprising in Iran are still there. The poverty, hunger, corruption, embezzlement, repression, lack of freedoms. You mentioned women taking off their scarves. 29 women have done that so far, and all 29 were arrested by the regime. And of course, our president-elect, Mrs. Rajavi, though herself wears a scarf as a Muslim woman, she openly condemned it, issued a statement, spoke at the Council of Europe about it, has been tweeting about it, has been calling on Iranians to oppose it. So in this sense, we are very optimistic. Now, you mentioned President Trump. I think that the world now is a small village. So the role of the United States, I think, is very critical in this. Short of sending the Marines, I think there's a lot that the United States can do. Speaker Gingrich spoke about imposing sanctions. I think a lot can be done. I think Iranians have to be cut off from the international banking system. And if you deny them the resources, they cannot pay their shock troops. They cannot pay the Revolutionary Guards. They cannot pay their agents. And that will encourage Iranians to continue their protest. I think expression of moral support, political support for what the people of Iran want is extremely important. By the same token, I think, just as, for example, President Reagan voiced public support for the Solidarity movement and Lech Walesa in Poland, I think a public expression of support for the organized opposition will go a long way in encouraging the people of Iran to see that the United States stands with them and is going to make sure that the mullahs cannot do what they did back in 2009 in virtue of President Obama's silence and inaction.
Yeah, I really hope so. And I believe, you know, I believe in a certain amount of providence. And I think with our president getting into office, even though he has not been liked by the globalists of the EU, but we also see the EU doing a lot of things that are not in support for the Iranian people. And I think bringing a high-ranking leader to the EU Parliament was almost a slap in the people's face. Mm-hmm. So I think at this point, excuse me, I'm not sure how much we can expect from the EU. I think there's movement in the EU and the European Union where people are getting tired of, the citizens are getting tired of a lot of the globalists' agenda in bringing all these migrants in without any kind of policy or program and assimilation. And, you know, we had, so when the Iranian leader went to the EU, that was also a slap in the face in a lot of the Jewish people that live there in Brussels and in Poland and that area, because the Iranian regime anyway have been Holocaust deniers. And so when you put that together and you have them come to the very place where the Holocaust took place, and there are a lot of, you know, Jewish people there in the EU, in Parliament, in part of the coalitions there, it doesn't really bode well for the leadership of the EU right now. So how do you see them playing a part? Because it would be really great if some, excuse me, some of the leadership, whatever drink here, in the EU would join forces with our president and at least be a voice for the people of Iran. Because, and you know, Iran, the leaders there also called death to Israel. They really have been a great, you know, evil force in the Middle East.
Yes. Well, I think that, I guess if experience is any example, you know, we in the United States began from the grassroots. And we worked in every state. You know, Iranian Americans in this country are highly educated. They're very active. They care about their country. They haven't lost sight of their heritage and culture, and all of them, many of them, those citizens of the United States now want to go back to Iran. And of course, we built that country with what they have learned here and elsewhere in Western Europe. But we began a grassroots effort, and we reached out to our members of parliament, with members of Congress, our senators. And of course, as you know now, there's a tremendous bipartisan support for all of these sanctions legislations against the regime in Tehran. I think that Iranians in Europe are also, in a sense, following in our footsteps. I see every day protests and demonstrations by Iranian Europeans in different European capitals, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Oslo, Norway, and calling upon politicians in Europe to speak to the atrocities that this regime is perpetrating. And I think at the end of the day, I think the more that Iranian people will persevere, the more that they continue to challenge the regime in Tehran, and our activities in the United States, our fellow compatriots in Europe, I think the European will come to see the light of the day. You know, I think that they have to recognize that a detested theocracy is on its last breath. And I think that if they do not want to overlook the forest for the trees, they will see that the dawn of freedom is finally rising on Iran. And I think it is to their even long-term strategic interest to side with the winning force, to be on the right side of history, because when this regime is overthrown, Iranian people will remember their friends, and they will remember who, in darkest times of their history, stood by them and those who did not stand by them. I think Iranians will never forgive, nor will they ever forget people who helped them out and people who helped their oppressors. And that's the way it is. And so I think it is to the Europeans' own interest to give up their short-term economic windfalls from dealing with this regime and take the strategic long-term view, as has the United States done under President under President Trump.
So, I just had a thought I wanted to ask you, and I've got to think about it again. I remember now. So, if Iran becomes stable, if the regime is overthrown at some point, and the citizens are able to take the country back, which we know revolutions are very difficult, costly in lives, and then to reorganize is very difficult. And luckily they have organizations like yours that can help facilitate that. But when that day comes, do you see the Middle East, the region of the Middle East, become more stable?
Well, that's an excellent question, Debbie. You know, I'm a sociologist by career, and I studied larger scale social transformation. I studied the Middle East. I studied the social change. And I must tell you that in virtue of its geopolitical position in the Middle East, in virtue of its population, its culture, its history, and its enlightened people, Iran historically has always played a pivotal role in the situation in the Middle East. When the constitutional movement occurred in Iran in 1906, you saw, if you will, a rise in the desire of the people of the region toward parliamentary democracy. When Dr. Mossadegh became the prime minister and he went to the United Nations Security Council to defend the rights of the Iranian people in nationalizing their oil, when he returned, he had a stopover in Cairo. And remember that Egypt is a Sunni country. 3 million Egyptians came to welcome him, although he was from a Shia country. And you saw the rise of these nationalist movements in the Middle East. And so when Khomeini, or when the Shah governed Iran, as you know, there was a tilt toward the Western countries. And when Khomeini came and began his extremist policies, the slogan of death to America, death to Israel, liberating Jerusalem via Karbala, and similar slogans, you saw the rise of the extremists. So we are clearly convinced and firmly believe that when this regime is overthrown, and it will be overthrown, that's a verdict of history, that Iran becomes democratic, it will have a lasting influence on all of its neighbors, first and foremost Iraq and Afghanistan, and obviously in Syria and in Lebanon. Hezbollah will not be receiving billions of dollars from a democratic Iran. Assad will not be supported. The terrorist Houthis will not be funded, and Al-Qaeda will not receive any support. And so both from a practical perspective, but also from an ideological perspective, this Islamic extremism will lose its backbone, which is the regime in Tehran. And so we're very optimistic. And I think that the day where you see all the nations of the Middle East, the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Christians, and the Jews living in peace together is not very far. I'm reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi said once, that tyrants and dictators may seem invincible, but they will not last, and freedom will ultimately triumph.
I think that's beautiful, and I think that's a beautiful way to end our show tonight. I do want to say that I've known many Iranians over the years my very first house I ever bought. I had an Iranian realtor, and that was many years ago, from Iran. And there's a lot of them living here in Utah, where I live right now. And they are the most delightful people. They are, like you said, very educated. We have many that are doctors, lawyers, very well educated, very proper people, polite, cordial. A lot of them have nice restaurants here and shops that I go, because I lived in the Middle East for 7 years, as I told you. And so there's a lot of things from the Middle East that I can get at those shops that I can't get anywhere else. So I love it. I also own I think it's a 10 by 12 Tabriz that I bought many years ago when I was living in Saudi, and I don't think you can really get many of those today. And I hope that's not a dying art in the region, the Tabriz region of Iran, because anybody who knows anything about Persian carpets, they are the premier of all Persian carpets. They are the king of carpets. So I'm very, very, very blessed to have one.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Ali, for coming on tonight and sharing with the audience what is really going on. When we hear the chants of death to America, when we hear the Sunnis and the Shias and all that, it's all propaganda. I knew that when I was living in Saudi Arabia. The news that we got there was different from the news here. It's such a contrast. So it's so great to have somebody who knows what's going on in the inside to explain it to us, and also see that there is light and hope for the people of Iran, and the hope for the people of Iran means hope for stability and peace in the Middle East. And I am really going to stand with you in that hope. You can find Ali at, I have his tag there, AMSAFAVI, Sali Safavi. He also is with, and the tag is on the page for, let's see, it is you're part of the national, let's see, I did have the tag on there. I don't know what
National
happened.
Council of Resistance of Iran.
Right, but the
Our
website
is ncrius.org.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So look for Ali, follow Ali. He's also got a lot of great followers and people that he follows. You can learn a lot just going to his Twitter feed and reading the tweets and the between all the people that follow him and that he follows, because this is what's currently happening right now in the Middle East. It is very pivotal to the peace in the Middle East that we keep our eye on what is going on in Iran and support the people and citizens of Iran. So Ali, once again, thank you so much. I hope to have you back. And I hope, you know a lot about the Middle East besides just Iran, and so there's a lot more we can talk about. But I hope there'll be a day that you'll come back on my show, and we will be celebrating the liberation of the Iranian people.
Well, thank you very much, Debbie, for all the time you gave me. I'm delighted to have been able to contribute a little bit, and I certainly hope that the day comes that you can have your show from a free Tehran and talk to your audience. So what a great day that would be.
It'll be a great day, a great day. So once again, everybody, remember, like I always say at the end of every show, to fight the good fight, because they never give up the con. Have a great evening, everybody. Thanks for joining. Follow Ali. Take care. We'll see you tomorrow, and have a great day.